The New York docks, January 1943. US Navy intelligence fears there are Nazi agents working in the shadows, causing damage. But there is an even bigger problem. US Army chiefs have just reluctantly agreed to invade the heavily fortified island of Sicily, in the southernmost part of fascist Italy. It isn't their preferred plan, but they've agreed to do it with their allies, the British.
Sicily is an incredibly challenging operation for an army that's new to war.
But there could be a solution to their problems right under their noses in New York. The Mafia. The Mafia can police the docks and make sure the US Army get a warm welcome in Sicily. After all, it's where most of the New York mafiosi come from.
Mob boss Lucky Luciano, he was a permanent guest of the United States government, you might say, in prison. As he said, I'm from Sicily. I have a lot of friends there.
US Navy personnel enter secret negotiations with Lucky Luciano and the New York Mafia and start planning for the invasion of Sicily. But they don't tell their allies, the British, what they're doing. From now on, if the US is going to fight, they're going to do it their way. Italy is thrust into the heart of the Second World War by its flamboyant military dictator, Benito Mussolini. The father of fascism and Italian leader since 1922. On the road to war, he will become Nazi Germany's greatest ally.
The Mussolini story is one of the most amazing in European history. His entire reign in Italy was a spectacle of ever more ornate uniforms, chest thumping, strutting up and down the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia.
La concezione superficiale e pittoresca di quel pittoresco che io detesto.
In front of hundreds of thousands of Italians screaming his name and title, Duce, Duce. It means boss. Believe, work, fight. That's what he wanted out of the Italian people.
And in fact, Mussolini, at least until 1934, is considered to be a mentor to Hitler. He certainly saw in Mussolini a symbol of what he wanted to become, a powerful man, fully in charge of a nation.
In 1936, Mussolini and Hitler strike their Axis alliance and agree to carve a new world order together with military conquest.
The whole uprising of Nazi Germany would have been almost impossible without Mussolini. This was one of his happiest days, Hitler said this, when Mussolini enabled him to create this axis from Rome to Berlin. So, and he stuck with that loyalty.
In 1940, the two dictators ignite the Second World War side by side, conquering territory across Europe and North Africa. But 3 years in, the war is starting to turn sour for Mussolini. His Italian forces are on the brink of a crushing defeat in North Africa at the hands of the British and American allies. Suddenly, Mussolini's reign in Italy looks fragile.
This is where Mussolini starts blaming it on the genetic incapacity of the Italians to fight a war. However, it was becoming evident that Mussolini himself held most of the responsibilities for these striking defeats. Hitler realized that His personal relationship with Mussolini was costing him more than was giving him. And so the balance of power between the two leaders shifted in favor of Hitler and Nazi Germany.
In Casablanca, Morocco, not far from the fighting against Mussolini's forces in North Africa, the leaders of Britain and the United States meet for a conference. The campaign in Africa has been their first as allies, but now there are difficult decisions to be made. President Franklin D. Roosevelt is under pressure to attack occupied Europe and bring the war to an end as soon as possible.
For Roosevelt, you now want to agree to a 1944 invasion of France. So that becomes your overwhelming priority. Invade France and you'll be able to march into Germany proper. For the Allies, it becomes the great bone of contention. Churchill seems worried about any invasion of France. He believes an invasion of France where you would take on the German army directly could be a bloodbath for the British.
Winston Churchill proposes an alternative plan. He believes Germany's ally Italy is the soft underbelly of occupied Europe. And their key island of Sicily looks vulnerable. The beautiful but rugged island is the Wild West of Italy and the gateway from North Africa to Europe.
Churchill says, well, no, look, we've got all these million troops in North Africa. We, of course, must go into Sicily because it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from North Africa. So it makes absolute sense. And he's able to come up with arguments that are very difficult for the Americans to fight against.
If you take Sicily, you're actually then going to be able to control sea communications across the Mediterranean. It's a real blow to the Mussolini regime to use Sicily.
The British, with their very well-trained civil servants with their big red binders, coming out with big leather-bound books full of information. And the Americans are persuaded that, okay, we'll go to Sicily.
On the 9th of July, 1943, a vast amphibious invasion force plows through a rare summer storm in the Mediterranean. Shielded by the gloom, over 3,000 ships carry 160,000 men towards Sicily. The Allies are heading back to mainland Europe for the first time since Nazi Germany enslaved the continent.
And the material might that is on display just 3 years after those events is absolutely just mind-numbing. It's the biggest amphibious invasion ever mounted.
You can imagine the amazement of actually touching European continental soil. I mean, this is an amazing moment in the war.
The Allies hit the Sicilian beaches in two prongs. To the east of the island, the British, led by General Bernard Montgomery, and to the west, the US forces, led by General George S. Patton.
The Allies look at Patton and Montgomery and they say, these are the two best commanders we have, and these guys should lead the invasion. But Montgomery and Patton, they're both very mercurial, volcanic figures, both seeking the laurels of victory. So it was inevitable that these two would clash on the race northward.
As the Allies start to move inland, the alert goes out to the island's defenders that an invasion is underway. Around 200,000 Italian Sicilian troops and several veteran German divisions scramble to dug-in positions all over the island.
Once the Allied attack on Sicily began, Mussolini declared in a speech that the Italians were ready to fight for the defense of their own motherland. So Sicily would be defended step after step, meter after meter, and coastal divisions were created in order to fight against the Allied invaders.
For several days, fighting rages across Sicily, and the Allies take heavy casualties. But then, In parts of the island, there is a shift in the battle. In some towns and villages in the west, the Americans walk in virtually unopposed.
The Sicilian campaign, coastal defense divisions probably gave a pretty good account of themselves, only in the first couple of days of the fight. After that, most of those units melted away.
In one Sicilian town, the scene is so peaceful, an elderly man even approaches an American tank. Although this is no regular old man. It seems the Americans have some important connections on the island.
On the 19th of July 1943, American tanks arrive in Villalba, and Don Calogero Vizzini, who is the kind of king of Villalba, clambers aboard an American tank and disappears off. And there is absolutely no way that a 60-year-old gangster would be getting onto a Sherman tank unless he'd been authorized to do so. The key thing to really understand about the Sicilian campaign, it cannot fail. And if that means talking to criminals, gangsters, what are you going to do?
For the past 6 months, US military intelligence have been hatching plans with the American Sicilian mafia, reaching out to contacts on the island. The impact of their work is not fully known, but dons in the west of the island hate Mussolini for cracking down on their business, and they want his regime gone.
And through a link with the #1 mafia chief in Sicily at the time, what has been agreed is that he will encourage Sicilians to lay down their arms. And a lot of the troops in Sicily, particularly the coastal divisions, are Sicilian local troops.
One of the interesting aspects of the Allied enterprise in Sicily is the fact that many soldiers, especially from the American army, were of Sicilian descent. And so there was a blood connection between the invaders and the local population. And this, of course, facilitated the American advance in Sicily.
And it's great for Patton, and it's great for the Americans because they take huge swathes, so it looks really good on the map back home. There's lots of photographs and film footage of Patton being received by cheering crowds in Palermo. You know, he gets all the plaudits, they get all the gain for not much of the pain. Great.
Patton and the Americans surge forward. In under 2 weeks, they storm around western Sicily. But in the east, the key enemy port of Messina is still left to take. And Allied infighting is threatening to derail the campaign. The British, who are struggling their way up the east of the island fighting the Germans, seem wary of the American success and have been creating obstacles that impede their advance. Britain's General Montgomery has moved his forces onto a central highway in an American sector of the island, blocking their route to Messina.
And Montgomery was extremely nervous about his prestige and about slights and that sort of thing. Montgomery felt superior. Patton felt superior to Montgomery because Patton was Patton.
Incandescent with rage, Patton has been forced to detour through coastal roads near Palermo, determined to still take Messina first.
He was incredibly impatient. A peasant's donkey was blocking a road, and Patton stalks over and shoots the donkey in the head and shoves it off the road.
Part of Patton's makeup is that he has to be #1. You know, he's got to be the best. And the next best thing is for America to be best.
If that's your vision of war, get over yourself. War is not a sporting event. You're fighting the war to beat the Germans.
As the Allied generals squabble, a prized German division, who could have been cut off and destroyed, evacuate the island from Messina with tens of thousands of other enemy troops.
I've often thought the silliest phrase in all of World War II, the race to Messina. Patton gets there a little bit early, but it's as if we say today, Elvis has left the building. The Germans have left the building. They're already gone. They're off the island.
Patton and Montgomery have failed to wipe out the Germans during the fight for Sicily. back in mainland Italy, the Germans' escape is small consolation for the Italian fascist regime. Their forces have been routed again, and they've lost a key island right on their doorstep. Benito Mussolini is at a conference with Adolf Hitler when he hears that Sicily is about to fall and the Italian capital, Rome, has been bombed.
Mussolini's just shattered by this idea. And Hitler's, of course, furious. You know, how can the Western Allies be now bombing Rome and you're telling me that your army is strong and everything's going to be fine?
When Italian cities begin to be bombed, they do enormous emotional damage as the entire Italian people suddenly realize how vulnerable they are to Allied military power. And I think that is the crucial turning point for Mussolini.
Mussolini is called back for an emergency meeting with the King of Italy and the fascist Grand Council. There is a deathly atmosphere.
The situation of Mussolini is becoming desperate. And this is when both the king and the most important figures of the fascist regime decide that they had enough. And Mussolini's road to power actually had come to an end. For a leader that had had absolute control over a country for more than 20 years, being deposed that way had to be something quite dramatic on a psychological level.
Mussolini is placed under arrest and taken to a secure hilltop hotel in central Italy. And an Italian interim government begins to put out secret feelers to the Allies about switching sides. In Quebec, Canada, Roosevelt and Churchill are at a conference to discuss US proposals for a D-Day attack on occupied France when they hear the news coming out of Italy.
Churchill said, oh my God, let's start pushing on into Italy and help them switch sides, and then we'll be all the way up in the Alps before you know it. Make Italy the prime area of Allied effort in 1943 and 44. So you don't do France, you go along the Italian coast and up into Germany proper.
The success of the Sicily campaign seems to justify Churchill's strategy. Ambushed, President Roosevelt feels he has little choice but to yet again accept the Prime Minister's plan and agree to invade Italy.
Churchill is very clever and wily, and he says, Italy will be so easy to take. You know, the Germans are running away. There's really nothing much there. This is going to be a super easy victory that's not going to take many Allied troops. And so again, they managed to convince the Americans. So the decision to go into Italy is taken, you know, with sort of heavy heart by the Americans. But again, Churchill has gotten his way.
It's amazing how that changes. Just invade Sicily, to Italian chaos, to, okay, you can invade Italy, because they think Italy is going to switch and they will be able to take over much of Italy relatively quickly.
But as the Allies draw up invasion plans to attack Italy, their preparations are derailed by a scandal. America's most effective general seems to have lost the plot.
Patton's most famous moment in the Sicilian campaign, unfortunately, has nothing to do with beating the Germans. It has to do with beating a couple of his own soldiers in the hospital. Patton is on a tour of a hospital. He says to one, "What are you doing here?" And the young man gives the equivalent of, I just can't take it anymore, sir. He'd been under fire too long. And of course, Patton's response to slap him, to put some backbone into him. But American officers, and I might also add British officers, don't lay hands on their men. Patton's mental state is not good on Sicily.
As the controversy swirls, Patton is withdrawn from frontline duty, and a rookie general, Mark Clark, is put in charge of the US troops destined for Italy.
Clark is a glory hound, a glory seeker. He had a really meteoric rise in World War II. Clark is just chafing, I need an army, I need an army. And so for the first time, you know, Clark is going to be really tested with command.
In a profession known for towering egos, Mark Clark might have had the most towering of all. He insisted that photographs be reshot if he wasn't shot to his best advantage. Clark, unfortunately, mixed arrogance with a vast overestimation of his own abilities.
I'm not really quite sure why he's been so vilified. I mean, all American commanders have got a lot to learn, and I think Mark Clark definitely falls into that category.
In September 1943, the Allies' amphibious invasion of Italy gets underway. Mark Clark sends his US forces towards Salerno on the southwest coast of the country. But as they travel, news filters through to the men that Italy is on the brink of surrender. The atmosphere on board is almost celebratory. Clark and his men are expecting only weak resistance from Italian troops in Salerno.
Mark Clark basically thinks they're going to land unopposed, so he decides to send the troops in without any preparatory bombardment, basically to send them in open. It's the most dangerous landing the Americans ever undertake in the Second World War. And what they did not comprehend is the Germans were there, and the Germans were there in force.
The German divisions that escaped from Sicily are in Salerno.
From a German perspective, Sicily was a successful defense operation to buy time. The German army must demonstrate to the world that we are going to push them into the sea. Politically, we must demonstrate the capabilities of the German army to build up a proper defense in Italy.
While the Allies planned their invasion, the Nazis were taking control of Italy. On a crisp mid-September morning, gliders land outside Mussolini's Italian prison window. German commandos have come to bust him out.
It is a perfect story to tell to the German audience, how these super German soldiers, and it's a cool operation. Mussolini was rescued, and everything is okay.
Mussolini is flown to be reunited with Hitler and told the Nazis have a plan to put him back in charge of Italy.
The picture of Mussolini being, quote-unquote, rescued by the Germans is not the picture of a man overjoyed to be brought off the mountaintop. It's a man who looks rather tired and slightly scared because he's now back in the frying pan. And he, I think, has a suspicion about what the Germans will do with him. He is there to enforce German wishes.
At this very moment, the Germans say, okay, now we are preparing to occupy Italy. Because obviously, if the Italians want to get rid of Mussolini, they want to get rid of the Germans as well. Italy might leave the war, might surrender to the Allies, and this is, we can't allow that, obviously. For them, it was, the Italians are cowards, so the weak Italians, and there was a very harsh German reaction.
German forces have poured into Italy from the north, with orders to be ready to occupy the country. Meanwhile, the Italian interim government under Marshal Badoglio signs an armistice with the Allies and surrenders on the 8th of September. But they neglect to tell their troops.
While Italian soldiers were wildly confused about the new situation in which they found themselves, the German troops were actually very much ready to move against the Italians.
And so these German groups approach them, and they think they're colleagues, they're comrades in arms. And some of them are shot, some of them are beaten up. And the Italians are just in shock.
Tens of thousands perished and died in German captivity. Once the Germans occupied northern Italy, it was a very brutal and criminal warfare against the Italian population. They also killed women and children, and you have a lot of massacres, especially in 1944, by frontline troops.
With Italy occupied and Mussolini installed as a puppet leader, veteran Nazi General Albert Kesselring assumes control of the military arrangements. Smiling Albert has auditioned for the job by promising he will fight for every yard of the country.
There are numerous pictures of him smiling, laughing, sharing a joke. But having said that, he treats Italy as if it were the only struggle, the only campaign being fought. He doesn't care if every single inch of Italy is destroyed. It's not his country.
Back at Salerno, the Americans' amphibious invasion of Italy is still stuck near the beachhead 4 days after landing. Kesselring and his German forces have surrounded and rained hell on the landing site. Nearly 3,000 US servicemen are killed or injured. And rookie General Mark Clark starts to lose his nerve.
Salerno is Clark's baptism of fire, right? I mean, his first real experience of command, and Clark doesn't do particularly well. He panics when the Germans counterattack, and he talks to the admiral in charge of the embarkation and says, "Can we withdraw? Can we pull back and land somewhere else?"
The Germans start using loudspeakers to say to them, "You better surrender or you're going to die." And many of them do die.
With Clark floundering, the word goes out to Montgomery and the British landing in the south that their support is needed. Montgomery moves to help, although he takes his time. And with the aid of a massive naval bombardment, the Germans are pushed back from Salerno. But the whole incident leaves Mark Clark feeling humiliated, and with a festering resentment towards the British. He's determined to show that in the future he will fight his way and win.
The Salerno Bridge almost puts him in the position of being a beggar, entreating his superior for reinforcement. And I think Clark developed an almost pathological, almost paranoid suspicion that the British were maneuvering to get more than their fair share of the glory in the Italian campaign. But the real problem in Italy is that you have a very savvy opponent dug into some of the most forbidding terrain on planet Earth.
As Mark Clark and his US troops move out of Salerno and head north, they're relentlessly bludgeoned by Kesselring's retreating forces. Italy's unique, narrow, mountainous terrain is perfect for ambushes and sabotage.
It's very, very easy to defend in Italy. You know, you've got sort of lots of mountains, narrow passes. When you retreat, you kind of blow up the bridges, IEDs all over the place. It's an awful place in which to fight.
In the midst of a harsh winter, Clark's forces crawl up the western flank of Italy, taking tens of thousands of casualties. In January 1944, they reach the town of Monte Cassino, 100 miles up the peninsula, and realize that the German defenses in the south were nothing. Looming in front of them is the Germans' Gustav Line. With a huge peak at its heart, it's intersected by fast-flowing rivers and fortified with artillery positions and machine gun nests, dug in right across the mountain range.
The Gustav Line ranged from the West Tyrrhenian Sea to the Eastern Adriatic Sea, which were surmounted by very high peaks, which were incredibly well defended by the German army.
Italy is a natural fortress, particularly for artful defenders like the Germans, who carve every hilltop and every road and every canyon into these fortified positions to flank every Allied axis of advance. Positions that have been kind of graphed into killing fields by German engineers.
Undeterred, Clark sends his men forward to breach the Gustav Line.
And it's just a suicide mission. Commander of the 36th Division says to Clark, "This is impossible. I'm going to lose every guy. Don't make me do this. There's just no hope." And Clark says, "You got to do it. You got to do it." And it's just, you know, it's just absolutely a waste of life. The 36th Division is annihilated trying to cross this river multiple times.
Fighting from one hill to the ravine, to the mountain, to the next river, to the next mountain. This is going to go on forever. And one of these days, your number's going to be up.
Assault after assault on the Gustav Line ends in bloody failure, and Clark is eventually forced to call off the attack. The Allies have literally hit a wall in Italy.
And so suddenly the whole kind of premise on which the Italian campaign has been launched has been thrown into kind of, you know, disarray. The problem is that Churchill has staked his reputation on this, and you've got yourself stuck. And there's no way of kind of seemingly getting through it.
But wily Churchill won't give up on his plan. He believes he can show the Americans how to win in Italy. In January 1944, he persuades the US Army to launch an amphibious attack behind the Gustav Line to draw the German forces away. The force lands at Anzio on the west coast, just south of Rome. But they're walking straight into a trap.
Kesselring can destroy every inch of Italy if he thinks it'll impede the Allied advance. He literally does not care. One of the things Mussolini had done was to walk in the footsteps of the old Roman emperors and drain the Pontine marshes south of Rome. It's just a way you knew that the emperor cared for you as he undertook this public works project.
The installation of hydraulic pumps created a wealthier environment for poor peasant families from northeastern Italy to settle in.
But with the Allies advancing, just before Christmas, the German army take control of the pumps.
The Italians actually begged the Germans, "Oh, please don't destroy the reverse pumps." And they did.
Their farms have now been washed away. There's no place to live.
There is an even more sinister development to come. The Nazis know that stagnant salty water will breed malarial mosquitoes. And there is a vicious outbreak of malaria all around Anzio.
The Germans took full advantage of the prevalence of malaria in Italy and launched a kind of biological warfare against the attacking Allies. In some cases, they reversed the pumps to pull seawater into the marshes because the brand of mosquito that caused malaria thrived best in brackish water, to infect the Allied forces, but also to infect the Italians.
With the surrounding area flooded with malarial marshland, the US forces on the Anzio beachhead have little way out. Bogged down, their position is surrounded and then pummeled by the Germans with a giant railroad-mounted gun.
And you know, soldiers are crude people, and so it wasn't the beachhead, it was the bitchhead. It was a miserable place to be. The weather, the German observation, the sense of being cramped, of not being able to maneuver.
It's the last time the Americans will want to listen to one of Churchill's plans. Meanwhile, Italy's puppet ruler Mussolini stands idly by as the Nazis continue to inflict more and more pain on his own people.
It's a combination of being pretty terrible and pretty helpless at the same time. So he does things like he has his son-in-law executed because the Germans want him executed. He becomes this sort of pathetic, helpless, and yet at the same time, cruel figure.
That February, back at the Gustav Line, a new face has shown up to try and break the Allies' blood-drenched deadlock. Montgomery has been urgently recalled to England under secret orders, and General Bernard Freyberg has reached Mark Clark and the Americans' position with a corps of British Army troops. Clark bristles at his arrival, but Freyberg is a respected veteran from the North Africa campaign, and he has a plan. He proposes a massive aerial bombardment against the historic hilltop town of Cassino.
So Bernard Freyberg, probably not the sharpest tool in the shed. And Freyberg goes, the only way we're going to do this is if you absolutely paste it in bombs.
And off in the distance, top of that hill, a white monastery, Monte Cassino.
The monastery at Monte Cassino is one of the gems of Italian culture, which is really saying something after all. Started in the 6th century. I mean, Kesselring is the one who says that fighting in Italy is like fighting in a museum. Every time you bomb something, you're destroying something probably irreplaceable culturally.
And Clark is against bombing the monastery because Clark says, you know, it would be a crime against humanity. It would be destroying this great, you know, cultural treasure, and for limited military gain because the Germans aren't using it. But ultimately, the decision is taken to bomb the monastery and flatten it.
By the next morning, the ancient monastery is in ruins, and hundreds of Italian citizens sheltering in the area are killed. But Clark, still infuriated that the bombardment went ahead, neglects to move on the position.
I don't think that destroying the monastery of Cassino had any value to the Allies. I mean, their perception was there might be German troops in there, and we know there weren't any troops in the monastery, and the Germans respected the monastery. In that very situation, I think it was a mistake.
And once the monastery was bombed, it became an ideal defensive position for the Germans. They were able to move into the rubble, which made breaching the Gustav Line even more difficult.
Five months in, the Italian campaign has become a destructive, deadlocked bloodbath. Churchill's promise that the country would be the soft underbelly of Axis-held Europe now seems utterly ridiculous. In Tehran, at the latest Allied conference, President Roosevelt has had enough of the British Prime Minister getting his way.
There's no joy in the fact that the American preference for striking in France has been vindicated by events in Italy. There's a sense of sadness about the losses for, no real strategic gain.
When it becomes clear that Italy is not going to be the soft touch that they're hoping, it's almost like a strategic bloodbath for Winston Churchill. He just has reached sort of mental exhaustion after all of his efforts. The Americans are like, this is over, this is done, we're invading France. Churchill is doing everything possible to keep the conversation going, to change their mind, and the Americans just eventually leave. They say, bye, we're doing it, you've agreed.
After Tehran, the date and plans for the D-Day assault on France are finally confirmed, although they're kept classified. But one of the few people to be informed is Sir Harold Alexander, the British chief of the Allied armies in Italy. Churchill tells Alexander not to let up in the Italian campaign. He wants a major new offensive to draw German forces away from France and D-Day. Alexander knows it will be the British Prime Minister's last chance to make the Italian campaign count.
Harold Alexander understands that his armies are playing a crucial role by trying to obliterate the Germans in Italy. They're basically pulling troops away from what's going to be the D-Day landings and ensuring its success.
Harold Alexander assigns Mark Clark to a vital role in his new Italian offensive. Clark is given command of a massively reinforced army on the Anzio beachhead and told that when the Germans fall into retreat from the Gustav Line, he must cut across and destroy them.
Clark's army will in effect be responsible for encircling maybe 50,000 troops, maybe 60,000 troops, maybe more. So if they could encircle them and finish them off, then this would be a huge blow to the Nazi forces.
To pull off his plan, Alexander is given huge reinforcements. An incredible array of forces from around the world, including Brazilian troops and freed Polish soldiers who have walked from captivity in the east, join the fight. Nearly 500,000 men move toward the battle-scarred Gustav Line. On the 11th of May, 1944, the huge Allied offensive erupts. And this time, it's utterly overwhelming. Albert Kesselring tries in vain to mount a defense.
The Air Force almost completely destroys Kesselring's headquarters. So rather than being able to actually regroup and redirect his forces, he's actually scrambling to move his headquarters on the Gustav Line.
The fighting may be bloody, but the Allies start to finally breach the defenses and cross the rivers that have frustrated them for so long. And the German army falls into a hurried withdrawal north, just as Harold Alexander has anticipated. The word goes out to Clark: bust out of Anzio and move east to cut the Germans off. But just as the Americans finally emerge from the Anzio beachhead, Mark Clark has a change of heart.
Clark despises his British ally. He feels not only have the Germans been shooting down at him for the last 6 months, the British have been talking down at him for the last period. And he has a very different conception of how he wants this campaign to run. Instead of that Anzio force cutting across the rear of the Gustav Line Germans, it makes a hard wheel to the left. And if you're looking at the map of Italy, you know what that means. Headed directly towards Rome. Clark directly disobeys Alexander's orders to somehow steal a march on him and get into Rome before he did.
So he's determined to be first into Rome, at any cost, including the cost of letting the Germans out of the Gustav line to escape to their next fortified line.
I think that Clark sees this as almost a personal trophy hunt against the British, rather than, again, seeing it as a fight against the Germans.
As the German forces, which might have been trapped by Clark, escaped north from the Gustav line. On the 4th of June, his US forces cross into the outskirts of Rome. The Nazis have long since left the city, considering it a strategic irrelevance. Nonetheless, Mark Clark flies in to lead a victory procession through the city.
He wanted to ride into Rome as a conqueror, and he finally does so, taking the cheers of the masses as he's just about to become the emperor of Rome. And it might be exactly how he felt in his heart of hearts. But he got his photo op in the Jeep coming around the Colosseum. It's amazing footage.
In the minds of the local population, the arrival of the Allies meant the end of the German occupation, which had been very harsh and very violent, and beam of hope that partially, at least, the war was over for them.
Rome is the first European capital to be liberated from the Axis yoke. You know, it is a great triumph. It is rightly plastered all over the front pages of newspapers and on the newsreels the following day, the 5th of June.
But then, just a day later, Clark wakes to find his glory in Rome is no longer in the news. In northern France, the plan he wasn't included in is now underway. D-Day has begun.
Clark has fought for 9 months to savor this moment, and it's only left in his hands for a millisecond. He's on record as making some ridiculous statement to the effect that they didn't even let me enjoy this for 2 days.
Rome has fallen, but it doesn't get the coverage that D-Day gets. But it's a perverse way of thinking. You're not fighting a war to get publicity over the forces at D-Day. You're fighting the war to beat the Germans.
And there's still going to be a heck of a lot of fighting in Italy. Why? Because a heck of a lot of Germans got away. And I have no doubt whatsoever that Alexander had some stern words from Mark Clark's decision to head for Rome instead of to play his assigned role in the battle array.
As D-Day explodes into life in France, Clark and the forces in Italy are told to move out of Rome and keep going. Ahead, there are at least 4 more huge German defensive lines still to breach. And as they crawl north, a human life is lost for every 5 yards gained. While all the attention and resources drain away to the battle in France, and then Nazi Germany.
What they should have done at that point, they should have stopped. But they still, for some reason, have this idea that something might happen in Italy.
On the 28th of April 1945, the world's eyes return to Italy for a brief dramatic moment. Benito Mussolini is captured by Italian rebels as he tries to flee to Austria. Il Duce is executed by firing squad and strung up alongside his mistress in a petrol station in Milan.
The image of Mussolini's corpse put on display for all to see was the final example of way things ended, with the country left in complete destruction in 1945.
Less than 3 months after Mussolini's death, the Allies' D-Day armies enter Berlin, and the Second World War is moving into its endgame. Nearly 60,000 Allied soldiers have given their lives in Italy, but not a single one has broken through to the fighting in Nazi Germany. And in 1945, the kingpin of the New York Mafia, Lucky Luciano, asks that he be released from jail for helping the Allies invade Italy. His plea is granted, and he is deported to Sicily, where he is involved in helping the Mafia take back control of the island. The Italian government continues to struggle against the Mafia in Sicily to this day.
If there's any silver lining for the, really horrific events in Italy, it's that it did grind down German strength. But you look at it in retrospect as a historian, you're like, why didn't we do something better?